Hey there, folks. This is Kevin Madison from Project Dragonfly. I hope you enjoy this podcast about Dragonfly community members doing inspiring work. If you have ideas for a guest or want to be more involved in this podcast, please feel free to directly email me. Thanks again for listening and enjoy the episode. This week I spoke with Debbie Clemens. She is a 2013 graduate of the AIP program with Chicago Brookfield Zoo. She is a lover of the zoo. She grew up going to the zoo in Chicago, but she realized around her 40s that it was time for a career change, and she really wanted to work with orangutans and get more involved with the zoo. She had a exceptional career at that point, but made the career shift. So I think this will be of interest to anyone who is considering a career shift or trying to figure out how to do that. She really took a leap of faith and took the plunge to make that happen through the AIP and her work with it, and now is the outreach coordinator for the US-based charity Orangutan Outreach that works in Indonesia and really helps make sure that orangutans are being protected and that orphaned orangutans in particular have some rehabilitation options. She does social media with that group and helps build partnerships. And I hope you enjoy this conversation with Debbie Clemens and her conservation work that she's been doing through Dragonfly and beyond. Okay, Debbie, thanks for joining. So happy to have you on the podcast. And I guess we could just start with, what have you been doing since Dragonfly? What was your Dragonfly journey like?
Yeah, well, hello, Kevin. Yeah, thanks for having me. My Dragonfly journey was so amazing. And I know people say life-changing a lot, but it really was for me, because I'm in, I think, a small percentage of Dragonfly students where I entered the program with the goal of changing careers. So it really has changed my life, because I had a completely different career, and I said, no, I want to do something with animals or the natural environment and conservation. And I somehow I'm going to get a job doing that. So it really was a life-changing thing for me. I had my background before Dragonfly was a recreation therapist. I worked with children with autism, and I had a very rewarding career for 20 years doing that. But I had always had a real love for animals and a real desire to help them and conserve biodiversity. And I grew up with Brookfield Zoo. That was my zoo. And I volunteered at Brookfield Zoo as a young adult. And so that kind of fed my soul for a little bit, but it wasn't enough. I finally got to the place, I was in my 40s. And I said, no, I need to make this like my full time. This is what I get to do all day long. So I started looking for graduate programs that I, could do. And all of them required a background in the sciences, and something in a related field. And I was like, oh, there's nothing for me out there. So one day I was just on the Brookfield Zoo website, because that's my happy place, right? So I would always go to that website just to look, and just it would make me smile. And I saw something about the AIP program. I remember I sat straight up and I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. This is what I can do. And they'll take
Nice.
me. I was so excited to find the program. So needless to say, I just dove in and I made the most of it. And since I didn't have that background, I was the student doing all the supplemental readings and all the extra stuff because I felt I needed it. But I engaged as much as I could, and I loved every bit of it. So, and that's, I guess, one thing I would say to current students is, you're going to get out of it what you put into it. And if you're just doing your assignments to get a little check mark, it's just not going to be as meaningful. You really got to get in there, and you got to engage in the conversations, as much as you are able. You can go above and beyond the required comments or whatever you're asked to do. And that's what I did. And because of that, I got noticed, right? So
Hmm.
I did the AIP program through Chicago Zoological Society at Brookfield Zoo. And I was in the 211 cohort. So it was only the second cohort Brookfield Zoo had. So it was still a very young program. And Agnes Kovacs is the manager of the program, and she was doing it by herself. So because of all the work I did and the extra I did, and the level of my assignments and such, she noticed that I was a good student and that I could be more involved. And so even before I graduated, she said, would you like to help me co-facilitate some of these in-person courses, and would you like to have a little bit more of a role? And I think she was kind of testing me out. And then as soon as I graduated, I was offered a job with Brookfield Zoo. And I
Awesome.
became, she was the manager of the program, and I became the senior coordinator of the AIP program out of Brookfield Zoo. And that's nothing I had planned.
Right.
It just kind of happened. And that was my hope when I started. I was like, if I just kind of jump, we're going to hope the net appears, and I'm going to put myself out there. And that's what happened. One thing after another just kind of came to me because I was doing so much and networking as much as I could. And I was going to conferences, and I was doing everything I could to get really immersed into what I wanted. And what I wanted was to be involved in orangutan conservation. And
So
that was the
yeah, if I
focus of
could
my
just
master
jump
plan.
in, and I want to hear how you got into the orangutan conservation as well. But just going back to your undergraduate, so what was your major that you felt that little bit of imposter syndrome coming into Dragonfly?
Well, it's hilarious because the actual name of my major from the University of Illinois Champaign was leisure studies.
Nice.
Oh my gosh. That one just killed my dad. He was like,
Right.
really? This is what I'm paying a tuition for? Leisure studies. But the emphasis was therapeutic recreation. And what therapeutic recreation is using leisure and recreation activities as a means of therapy for people with disabilities. So, a noble
Gotcha.
profession. It just had this hilarious name attached to it. So I worked with all different age groups, all different disability groups. And then I ended up specializing in working with children on the autism spectrum disorder. So that's what I did
Right.
for a majority of my career
Well, and
there.
that's actually a perfect background for Dragonfly, right? But for, a biology program, it's not the typical background that someone
Right.
might have. And it's also cool how you took that sense of whether it was imposter syndrome or just a feeling of like, I need to really study, I need to really go in 110%. And that actually motivated you to do more. So I would really hope that's the case for many of our other students who are coming in and feeling like, oh, I have a different background. Like, use that as inspiration rather than something to feel like you are not as qualified. So
Right.
that's awesome. And then also, were
Absolutely.
you working full time as well during while you were in the program?
I was not. So that's the other thing where I'm really in the minority of Dragonfly students is I said, if I'm doing this, I'm doing it 110%.
Hmm.
So I quit my job
Okay.
and never looked back. So, I mean, I was lucky that I was in a position to do that. I realized most people can't do that, right? I was
Right.
41. I was married. My husband had an income. I had support to do it. So I was
Hmm.
very, very fortunate that I was able to devote so much time to my
But
studies.
still very scary. I mean, I agree, like not everyone's
Mm-hmm.
in that position for sure, but still that is a big leap of faith that you took and leaving a career that already was you were feeling
Mm-hmm.
like this is actually something you care about, but just kept being called back to the zoo. And it was, as you said, the happy place
Mm-hmm.
going on the website and then seeing the AIP and
Yeah.
being part of that very early stage of Chicago Brookfield Zoo.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Very exciting as well. Okay, so how did you then transition into your love of orangutans?
Well, I've always had a love of orangutans. As I said, I volunteered at the Brookfield Zoo. And one of my volunteer roles for a couple of years was as a docent, right? So a volunteer
Mm.
educator. And we had different stations that were assigned to us. And I found that every time I was in front of the orangutans, I was drawn in. And that's where I wanted to be. And that's what I wanted to talk to the guests about. Those animals. Like, to me, when I look at an orangutan, I know there's a sentient being looking back at me, and there was just a special connection. And we talk about that in the zoo world and in the conservation world, that connection that you have to make, because if you connect, then you can care. And if you care, hopefully, then you're going to take action. And there was just something about orangutans that just pulled me in. Even though they weren't terribly exciting to watch. Like my first, inquiry in foundations class, I'm like, well, I can't do it on the orangutans. All they do is sit there, So I went and I observed the gorillas, and that was much more interesting. But I loved orangutans. So, it came from kind of just that early experience as a docent, getting connected to orangutans. So I said, well, this is what I'm going to make the focus of my master's work. And because it's the AIP and AIPs have a local focus, I focused on educating my community and helping people understand how they can play a part in orangutan conservation, even though they're 9,000 miles away. What can you do in your own life from here? What actions can you take locally that are going to impact these animals that live all the way, in Southeast Asia?
Right.
So,
Well, speaking of that, I think the connection for many people is palm oil, right? And I feel like there's always like such conflicting information out there on palm oil. What's the latest? Like, in your mind, what do you recommend to people at this point? Like, is it avoid it entirely or look for the, I don't know, fair trade type palm
yeah,
oil products?
definitely do not bother boycotting. Boycotting palm oil will not make one bit of difference, because even if everybody in the United States managed to boycott and stop using palm oil, it wouldn't even make a dent, because the United States is not the largest consumer of palm oil. That's like, I don't even know what the top country is now, but countries like China and India and Indonesia, they use way more. So it wouldn't make a difference if we boycotted. And even if we were successful in getting rid of palm oil through a boycott, another crop would have to take its place. There's always going to be a need for edible vegetable oil, and palm oil itself is a really good crop. It produces more oil per hectare than other crops such as soy, right? So if we switch to soy, we need even more space. So there'd be even more deforestation. So boycotting, definitely not the answer. Pushing for sustainable, yes, I believe in pushing for sustainable palm oil. That's what we need, because the palm oil industry is not going anywhere. It just isn't. We're not getting rid of it. So all we can do is insist that it is done more sustainably. And there is some progress being made there. It's still really, really hard to trace your palm oil and the supply chain all the way back and assure that it's sustainable, because it all ends up getting mixed together at some point. So it's tough to say you're really using sustainable palm oil, but you got to support those companies who are making the effort, or just avoid it altogether.
Right.
So
yeah, it's one of those things. It's like, it's so complicated, and sometimes you just throw your hands up and you be like, oh, why should I try and do anything? But the reality is having the conversations, doing the research, to try and find the sustainable or find out what the latest is, or learning, like you just said, that it's actually like pretty efficient in terms of as a vegetable crop producing oil. So understanding, because I think in the environmental movement, we often just want like a clear cut,
right.
like, yes, this, no, that, but like, it's always much more complicated. And we have to be willing to accept that, we have to be okay with that, or we're just going to keep making the same mistakes over and over.
It's hugely complicated, and it becomes geopolitical too. You can't ask Australia to stop to boycott and stop importing palm oil from Indonesia because they have trade in so many other things, right? Well, then Indonesia will get mad and say, well, then we're not going to get this from you and you can't have this. And it becomes like this whole mess geopolitically. So on so many levels, it's really complicated. Um, but yeah, so I wasn't thrilled when I was going through the program that I had to keep learning about palm oil. I'm like, I'm so tired of talking about palm oil, but you have to. I mean, that's just a part of
Well, I'm
orangutan
sorry to ask about
conservation.
it.
Oh no, it's
I knew
okay.
as I brought it up. It's like when I start talking about pollinators and people ask me about honeybees, I'm like, oh, here I go, and I give my little spiel. But we all kind of have that thing,
Yeah,
like the common language we start with. So so where has it taken you professionally in your work? Because I know
right.
you worked at Brookfield Zoo in that
Mm-hmm.
AIP coordinator position for a number of years. And
Mm-hmm.
what are you doing now? What have you done since then?
Right. So in the AIP, you want to or the GFP, right? You want to continue your master plan after you graduate. That's when you really want to get it going. So I was in a very fortunate position that I was working at Brookfield Zoo because even though my job was coordinating the AIP program, I was still in a conservation organization in the conservation department, and people knew what I had done and they knew about Dragonfly and my master's program. So I became the go-to person for orangutans. So even while I was in my role at Brookfield Zoo, I was able to educate like our volunteers or do different presentations, do palm oil presentations. So I was still very much able to do my master plan while at work. I was able to incorporate it because I was just in the right environment to do that. But I also, on my own, was doing things out in my community. As I mentioned earlier, I was going to conferences. So I was meeting the people in the conservation world, specifically in the orangutan conservation world. And I knew I wanted to work for an organization called Orangutan Outreach. And I had met the executive director at one of those conferences early on. And it took us kind of years of getting to know each other, and for him to trust me and for him to realize that I had the right intentions. I had the same mindset as him. We knew all the same people. We had been to all the same places in Borneo and Sumatra. We even ran into each other one time in Sumatra before I worked for him. So I was able to say, I think I could really help your organization. I think you should hire me. So it was one of these, I just created an opportunity for myself because he was a one-man show at that point. He had been running the organization for 11 years on his own. I said, you need help, and I'm your girl. So he created a position
Nice.
for me. So yeah, so since the beginning of 2019, I have been the outreach coordinator for Orangutan Outreach. And what an outreach coordinator does, right? It's all about raising awareness and educating. I was like, it was pretty much, the mission statement of my master plan. It's exactly, it lined up perfectly because that's what an outreach coordinator does, is getting people to understand what the issue is, getting them to care, motivating them to take action. And that's how I had written my master plan goal. So yeah, so I work from home.
Yeah,
Our
lovely.
charity is based in the United States, but we partner with organizations in Indonesia who are on the ground doing the work to save the orangutans, to rescue them from situations, distressing situations. We're rescuing ones that get trapped through forest fires, the ones who are coming too close to villages. And the big one is rescuing orangutans who are being kept illegally as pets. So those orangutans, mostly those are infants, are brought back to the various rescue centers. And then they don't have mothers because to get the baby, right, the mother has been
Mm.
killed. So now we have orphaned orangutans who have been kept as a pet, and they have to learn how to be an orangutan. So they go to the rescue centers where they get surrogate mothers, babysitters, right? The Indonesian women, wonderful, amazing women who become their caregivers and teach them how to climb trees, how to build a nest, how to find food, why they should be afraid of snakes. Every survival skill they would have been taught by their mother, we now have to have a human teaching them. So they usually, the babies, if they come in as babies, they have to stay at the rescue center up to 10 years before they really learn everything. And then the goal is to release them back to the forest where they belong. But to do that, we need forest to release them back into, right? So
For sure.
in addition to rescuing and rehabbing these orangutans and eventually releasing them, we have to be reforesting the whole time. So orangutan outreach supports every step of that process with 4 core partners that we have across Borneo and Sumatra, where, of course, those are the only 2 islands in the world where orangutans live.
So I would love to see some video of these Indonesian caretaker women teaching, trying to teach these orphaned orangs how to climb trees and be scared of snakes. So maybe there's some footage out there, but I feel like
there is. I'll send it to you.
Okay. All right. Is it on your website or
fantastic? Yeah, actually, the orangutan outreach website is redapes.org. And on there is a link to our YouTube channel. Tons of great, or you can just go straight to YouTube and look up orangutan outreach or redapes.org. Tons of videos on there. So we keep a very active YouTube page.
Amazing. I think my afternoon just shifted.
Yeah. Super cute babies. But I mean, that's part of the problem is orangutan babies are adorable, right? So people want them, but then they get older and they get stronger and then they get locked in cages. So it's a horrible situation. So we're rescuing as many as we can. We're returning as many as we can back to the forest. And for those who cannot go back to the forest because they were just simply in captivity too long and they don't have the skills, or they have a disability, or they have an illness. A lot of them are blind because of conflict, right? They've been shot with air rifles, right? So there's over 100 orangutans just with the organizations we work with who can never go back to the wild. So now we're working on giving them the best life they can have, so they're not stuck in a cage. We're building them individual islands to live on, so they have some sanctuary space. So it's huge. It's a huge undertaking. There's 3 species of orangutans. All 3 are critically endangered, and it's due to the activity of man. So I feel we need to do our part to reverse some of that, mitigate some of the damage, and help as many orangutans as we can, and hopefully save the species. Ultimately save all the species.
Yeah, and give them all a good quality of life, even the ones that can't be returned to the wild, and have that benefit, like you were saying, for populations, but to really support those individuals that have been hurt in that way. So it's you really have made your dream come true. The shift you talked about. You just weren't you in Malaysia recently, or?
I was in Indonesia. So I know this is hard for people. Geography lesson here. Unless you've gone on the Borneo EE, then you learn this, right? Orangutans live on the islands of Sumatra and Borneo. Sumatra is an island completely within Indonesia. It's an Indonesian island. The country of Indonesia is made up entirely of islands, thousands and thousands and thousands of islands. Sumatra is one of the big islands. The island of Borneo is transnational. So part of it belongs to Indonesia, part of it belongs to Malaysia, and there's a small part that belongs to Brunei. There's no orangutans in Brunei. So the dragonfly Borneo EE goes to the Malaysian part of Borneo. My charity, Orangutan Outreach, we only work in Indonesia. So yes, just a couple months ago, I was in Indonesia. I was in the Indonesian part of Borneo, which they call Kalimantan, and I was also in Sumatra. So what we do when we go is kind of make the rounds to all of our partners and check in on how they're doing and what their needs are, and do some ground truthing, and really figure out how we can best help. So I was just there in October into November. Yeah.
It does seem like, I mean, and we have a lot of Dragonfly students enter the program, or even alumni who would probably hear all this and be like, that's what I want. And I think sometimes in my role as an advisor, I'm like, I try to let people try to help people be realistic about, like, the fact is, like, it's not always going to lead to a job in a world-class zoo or a job with one of these amazing organizations where you can work remotely and travel. But that said, your example is like, yes, it can be done. And actually, we have a lot of those examples. Like, we have dozens of those examples in the program through the years. So I do think, for anyone listening, like, don't think it's not possible. We may say it's like not guaranteed, but if you put in that passion, you really try to do it, it can be built. And it's really cool, Debbie, that, like, you kind of had two positions, the AIP position kind of like built once it was seen how dedicated and passionate you were, and then this one with orangutan outreach as well.
Neither position existed, right? Or written for me. And that's, but I think that's kind of part of the magic of Dragonfly, and what I encourage people to do: not only do your best work, but stay connected, especially to your instructors, because they're out there doing amazing things. And there's so many people from the zoo world that you can connect with. And then people change jobs, and they change zoos, they change roles, and you still know that person. And now you have a contact somewhere else that they used to be at this zoo, but now they're at that zoo. So now you're locked in there. And I just really encourage all students to stay connected with their cohort and anybody else they meet in all their classes. The AIP students get to meet the GFP students. All the instructors are already, so many people are doing such cool things. And that's how you're going to get a job in conservation. It is not, I'm sending out resumes like that. I don't think it works that way anymore. You have to get out there and know people, improve yourself, and get out there and do the work.
Yeah. And the world doesn't, we always say this too, the world doesn't just need extroverts, right? I mean, it's great if you are that type of personality, but the world needs people that care and are willing to listen and are willing to just show up, right? Like, go to the conference. You don't have to speak at the conference, but at least go to the conference, like you were saying, and give it a chance, like, to meet a few people, introduce yourself, and just see what happens, see what develops.
Right. And I get, a lot of high school students, but a lot of college students contact me and, ask me for advice. And that's like, oh, it's so hard to get a job in conservation. And I was like, yes, but please remember, we don't just need field biologists, right? We need journalists. We need photographers. We need lawyers. We need so many people. So we need grant writers, right? So I'm like, what is your skill? What are you good at? And apply that to conservation, right? So sorry for the dogs barking. Maybe you're an artist, you're a musician, right? One of my sons is in college right now. His major is game design, video games. And I was like, great, let me know when you graduate, and we'll create a conservation game, right? If you want to be involved in conservation, you can be involved, and you can even have a profession that helps conservation, but that doesn't mean you're in the field,
right
there with your ethogram, right? Studying the animals. We need so many different types of people. We need psychologists. We certainly need conservation psychologists. So there's a lot of different things you can do to support.
That's a great point. And it's kind of interesting, like, seeing the world and how it's changing, and in some parts of the world, population growth starting to level off in some Western areas and European and parts of Japan, human populations, but consumption still being all-time high, and then other countries where population is going to continue growing massively. But the thing that strikes me is and I don't know if this is the case at all for orangutans, but I know like in some areas of the world where there are elephants, there's actually it's like the elephants might be rebounding a little bit. Populations might be rebounding in some areas, but then they're coming into conflict with humans more and more, ending up ingesting things at landfills. There's these stories in, I believe, Nepal of elephants going to landfills and ingesting things and dying or being horribly injured or sick. And so I think there's always going to be the need for the types of like shelters or organizations you're working with orangs, where you see more and more of that conflict coming into play. And it's just a complicated issue, you know, to help those species and help them, you know,
It is
survive.
very complicated.
So,
And you want to help the species, but at the same time, you have to consider the people who are living alongside of the animal, right? So yeah, when orangutans come close to a village, the villagers are scared, right? This huge animal, first of all, could raid their crops. So they fear for the safety of their livelihood. They fear for the safety of their family. You know, we sit here all these, you know, thousands of miles away going, oh, they're exotic, beautiful animals, just leave them alone. And I always say, yeah, but look at our own country. Look at how people feel about wolves and coyotes, right? Keep them out of my yard. They're going to eat my dog. They're going to eat my baby, right? It's the same thing. Those people are scared. And you have to understand that. And you also have to understand we're talking about third world countries where the people have very little money. And if we don't give them another alternative, they're going to go in and try to get a baby orangutan to sell on the black market, or they're going to, you know, go in and chop down the trees and plant palm oil because they need to make a living. So I learned this actually as a student when I went on the Borneo EE. You know, it was Mark Ankranez, who is the partner, one of the partners on that EE, said conservation is about people. And like that, like I got it. You know, if you do not meet the needs of the people, you cannot help the animals or the environment that you're trying to save. So that's huge. And it goes along with community-based conservation and involving the community too, but it goes beyond that. You just have to always have the people in the front of your mind if you want to get anything done.
totally love it. And so important to always remember that. So I know we started out before we started recording about like master plan, continuing your master plan. You've clearly done that. I know we've talked about Reddit. It's redape.org, right? Is the
Red Apes,
Gotcha.
redapes.org. Yep.
And so I think that's great. Is there anything else either like that you would want to say to current students or future students or alumni, or anything else you just want to draw our attention to in terms of your organization or your efforts?
Sure. Yeah. I think I stay involved with the Brookfield Zoo program, and I go back and I talk to the students at least once a year. I pop into the master plan and action class and try to help them figure out their master plan. And one thing we're seeing is that the students are already thinking ahead and saying, it's going to be hard for me to continue my master plan because I'm not changing jobs like you did, Debbie, right? Oh, of course it was easy for you, Debbie. You were working at a zoo and then you got your dream job. Of course you're doing your master plan. But what about me? You know, I work in an accounting office, you know, and I'm not changing careers, or my school's simply not allowing me to do what I want to do. So I'm seeing that, that kind of already I'm nervous. I don't know how to continue my master plan. So what I would encourage current students to do is to use the time in your courses, especially the master plan and action course, to think through that. Like, what can I do? Brainstorm with your classmates. That's what they're there for. That's the beauty of this program, is getting all that input. You probably can't figure it out on your own, but other people are going to have ideas and suggestions that you just didn't think of. Because again, if you want to help, the oceans, and you work at, a printing shop, okay, what's the connection there? You can find a connection. What can you do? Even if it's just talking to your coworkers, right? And giving them websites that they can check out, or they notice what you're bringing for lunch and you're like, hey, it's sustainable seafood, whatever it is, you have to just talk about your master plan. You have to engage as many people as you can. And again, then those opportunities turn up when you're talking about, and they're like, hey, you know what? Could you come and talk to my, volunteer group about that? Or, we have, a group that meets down at the VA every Thursday. I think they'd be interested in what you have to say. So you have to be representing your master plan everywhere you go. Especially if you can't make it a part of your job. So I really encourage students to be thinking about that. How am I going to keep this in my life? And for alumni who feel like they've gotten away from their master plans, it's time to reconnect with Dragonfly, which there's so many ways to do that, right? And reach back out to your cohort. In fact, my cohort, my 2011 cohort, we recently started getting back together because we miss each other so much. It's been, 10 years since we graduated, and we've been going out trying to get together once a month. And hey, what are you doing? Well, maybe you could do this, or maybe you could do this. Find those people who motivate you so you can get back into doing what you want to do and the way you always wanted to do it.
Totally.
Easier said than done. I know. I know.
There really is a strength in the community, though. The energy, right? Like, where else can you go that you start talking about, orangutans, or you start talking about pretty much anything about the natural world, and people get really excited, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think you're right that kindling that spirit, rekindling it, is great advice. Debbie, thanks so much. This has been lovely. For speaking of reconnecting, for you and I.
Yeah, right. I know.
Been years since I've seen you. Although, I did talk to Agnes recently, and she was, encouraging me to reach out, and then we were reaching out anyways to reconnect. So it's great to have this talk.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
Yeah. So many possibilities, and you really are an example of what, how that species-based conservation integrating humans can work for people.
Yeah.
So thanks again. And
my
thanks
pleasure.
all for joining us. Hi there, folks. Just one more thing before you head on out. If you have a moment, as I mentioned at the beginning, I would love to hear in what ways you are finding this podcast useful, how you listen, what you would like to hear more of, less of, etc. Please feel free to send me any and all feedback, any ideas for guests, etc., to Kevin Madison at my email, which is mattiskc@miamioh.edu. That's spelled MATTESKC @miamioh.edu. Thanks again for listening, and have a great day.